as I was thinking about what, compels me to write, one of the things that struck me is, as I mentioned, that sometimes there's just something that sticks with me, but other times it's sometimes that I'm looking at how something has changed or why what used to be typical is not typical anymore and why something else is, and trying to explore that.
This is People and Their Poems, a podcast about the poems that make a difference in our world. People and Their Poems is presented by Oronog Mountain Publishing. Thanks for joining us today.
Welcome to People and Their Poems podcast. I'm Sandy Carlson, your host, and I'm here today with Catherine DeNunzio, another Connecticut poet, to talk about her work and her inspiration. Catherine is the author of Enough Like Bone to Build On, published in 2022 by Antrim House Press. She's been published widely in journals and has read her work around the state. So it's a real honor to have Catherine here today. Thanks for joining me, Catherine.
Thank you for having me. I'm one that feels honored, I'll tell you. Thank you.
Well, it's great. And I should mention also that your poem, The Permission, was second place winner in the Nutmeg Poetry Award contest hosted by the Connecticut Poetry Society, which I had the honor of judging the entries for. And I loved that poem, and I felt close to you through that poem because I could identify with the father character in it, who is discovering something for his daughter that's right there in the backyard. And just a really wonderful, comforting poem. And it was just a great read. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what inspires you to write, Catherine? Where does poetry come from in your life, and what moves you to write?
Well, I think I've always been interested in thinking about things, I guess, which really the poem, The Permission, addresses. But I find that and have discovered, over the many years, that I feel most like myself when I'm writing. And so that becomes, reason enough, because it feels good to be writing. I think that there are, as far as inspirations go, I guess I think of them more as things that compel me. And those things that compel me include, sometimes it's a sensory detail that really kind of causes that feeling of time stopping, or that freezing or expanding, exploding of a small moment. So that kind of thing compels me. Certainly images from nature, experiences in nature. Sometimes it's a certain state of mind that can compel me to explore it. And sometimes it's things that seem to be contradictory, or things that just don't seem to fit. There's some reason something seems not to fit. And I have learned over the years that when I follow that and explore it, that there's usually something in there for me. And, sometimes I hope for a reader.
So, Catherine, how long have you been writing and discovering that writing is a place where you feel most at home with yourself?
Well, I started writing more seriously in college, in a writing course that I took, and, knew I really loved that. And when I took my first teaching job, I continued and wrote some. And over the years that I was teaching, I wrote some. And then when I retired, I was able to, you're a teacher, so I'm sure you understand that feeling that the writing of poetry and the teaching of kids, especially, I certainly with teaching English, which is what I did. Maybe it happens with other subjects too, but I think that it all comes from the same well, and that well depletes some with teaching, devoting yourself to finding ways to get kids to be at their best with subject matter and just with themselves.
Yeah, got it. So who was your first audience as a writer? Could you just describe what it was like to share your poems and get responses from people?
Yeah, probably. I mean, the writing in college, it was an open. We'd bring our work and share it, but it was we didn't do poetry in there. It was combination of writing essays and writing creative pieces. So that certainly felt great, to share things when I actually figured out how to do some things. And then my husband is also an English teacher and or was an English teacher like me, and that's how we met. And he also writes, and so he was probably my first real serious audience, and he was very encouraging, and I completely trust him as a writing partner and have from the get-go. So um, there's part of the answer about audience. And then when I've done readings, but you asked about first audience, so I answered.
Do you find it satisfying to go to readings and to participate in open mics? Do you find that an engaging experience as a writer?
Yes, I do. I like to. I don't do it that often, but certainly when I've given readings, even though I'm really nervous beforehand and have that anticipatory angst for, the many days before, once I start giving a reading, then it's just me and the words on the page, and just letting the words do whatever they can for an audience with whatever each audience member can bring to it. Um, what was your question?
I was wondering, did you find it rewarding to read your work publicly and to engage people through your poetry?
Yes. Yeah, yeah, I did.
Oh, wow. Would you share some of your poetry
Sure.
with us now?
Sure. I'll read one poem that, as I was thinking about what compels me to write, one of the things that struck me is, as I mentioned, that sometimes there's just something that sticks with me, but other times it's sometimes that I'm looking at how something has changed, or why what used to be typical is not typical anymore, and why something else is, and trying to explore that. So in this poem, um, I write and explore partly something that we've lost by no longer being a broadly agrarian society, and then some of the sensory and just a little bit of context. There's a mention, a reference to some ticks that the uncle in the poem exhibited, and those are just so. For those who wouldn't know, these are typical Tourette's ticks, blinking and shoulder shrugging and that kind of thing. And that was my uncle. So this is called the snake skin. Raised like a scar, my grandfather's name girdles the century old milk bottle I am holding. Inside, a snakeskin. In its day, the bottle held milk from his cows. Late summers, the family men moved bales from field to wagon to hayloft. With relentless drive and strength born of strength used, my uncle tossed the bales as a child might toss blocks into a storage box. As a boy, his vocal and motor tics meant he could not concentrate in school. Some afternoons, he'd be sent home. But in the field and barn, with the workhorses and the cows, all that neural firing was channeled. Is it true the snakeskin came from the barn and that he found it on a rafter in the loft? True, partly true. Stories get passed on. Maybe just their bones matter anyway, and the directions encoded in the genes. So we tell the stories that bring my uncle back to us. So my sons tick too. Harder these days for such boys, coiled with itch and energy, with no set way to wriggle out of their skins.
Oh wow, that was so evocative, so strongly visual, and just the barn as a place where your uncle could exercise his energy and be himself and have a place. And as you were saying, we're both school teachers. That notion that there's no place for certain children,
Yes.
right? If you don't, not the cookie cutter kid, see you later. And to not have a welcome place there where we're supposed to help people become new citizens and find their place.
Use their gifts however they're, however they were doled out.
Right, right. And this the image of the coiled energy that doesn't have that release anymore. What you were saying about the fading away of our agrarian heritage, and the outdoors, nature has a place for all of us.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for that one.
Thank you.
Would you like to read another?
Sure.
Okay.
Let's see. This next one, I mentioned before that sometimes it seems as if time just stops, freezes. And I think a lot of us have that experience of losing everything else except that moment that we're in, and it becoming, larger than time would suggest it could become. So this was one of those moments that I wanted to pursue in writing. This is called The Couple. For a moment in the early morning light, I did not recognize them. Their form merely suggested, their words indiscernible. Yet as they murmured, their exchange undulating like a slip hanging by an open window, I became pure consciousness, my synapses undistracted by the impulse toward language, my mind freed from the burden of reasoning, disconnected from the turmoil looming just beyond my threshold. I have always loved quiet scenes of spousal life in foreign language films. On a stage of domesticity, dialogue quotidian, instinctive, evocative, and within me, a longing untranslatable by subtitles on a screen. But this couple, this morning, they were you and I understood that with you, what I yearned for would always be available. Were I not I, were this not earth.
Very, very beautiful, Catherine. The whole untranslatability of the experience you're describing, to borrow one of your words, and the ending is an incredible surprise.
Thank you.
Can you speak to the inspiration for that poem?
Yeah, this one was born of, a real moment like that, and my husband and I had awakened. I think we just finished making the bed or something, or we were something like that. We were making the bed or just getting up. But suddenly I felt myself. It was not. It was somewhat like an out of body experience where I felt that I was just witnessing, and these. I lost the the sense of self that would have kept me from being able to observe. And so I was just kind of in this place where I was observing these two people, and it seemed very beautiful, and there was some kind of perfection there, and so it left me afterwards. I thought a great deal about, first of all, why that had happened, also why that, captivated me, and also why did it seem perfect, because the two people involved are certainly not, we're not perfect. And so I was trying to, just figure out what is it that gets in the way of um, when love is all that it can be for human beings. Why do we not feel that, that elevation always from it? And so I thought about that and about the kinds of things that being human it puts in our, that our humanity, our wiring, our temperaments, the kinds of things that get in the way of being able to just be pure self, one pure self and another pure self. So that's what took me there.
And the idea of being freed from language and
Yeah,
the I suppose that, and not in a negative way, but the ego, like to put that aside, to be in
right.
that moment
Yeah,
and to live it.
yeah.
Um,
And that impulse that we have towards assigning. I mean, that's what we do as writers, right? We're assigning language to sometimes to knowledge that we already have, but we don't have language for yet. Kind of that felt sense that I believe it's Genlin talks about, and so it kind of is like that.
yeah, and so this
Right.
sort of capturing it with words without limiting it by language is what
Yes.
the imagery of your poem does for your audience.
Thank you.
Yeah, amazing,
Oh, thank
amazing.
you.
How about another one?
Sure.
Okay.
This is another one where I'm writing from experience and in a dealing with grief. And well, I'll read the poem and then I can answer any questions that you might have about, its inception. It's called Unyielding Love. Poetry, do not give me words like these: bittersweet, brambles, barren, thorns, vines, terrain, or these: light, stars, moon, burgeoning, birth, deliverance, soothe, navigate, praise. Nothing that signals that since you understand, you have a suggestion, an answer, even. All I need to do is follow, is believe, is open my eyes, is be astounded by your life, my life, is accept that your wisdom can replenish the, not this word either, vessel that I am. Also, not gratitude, as in gratitude will anchor you. I have seen, as if in a mirror on a curve, that what is coming is not stoppable, may in fact be a beginning. Today, I finished with soups and teas, with clean sheets and towels and antiseptic wipes, with nighttime waking and dosing schedules, with ice packs and heating pads, with reverent awe. What I have witnessed is what anchors me. Her last breaths, his open eyes not reflecting. And what filled me with the peace I think you mean when you say gratitude was caring for them, was believing that unyielding love was power. It is a cloud with nothing left below to water or shield.
Well, I certainly feel that one. I think you're directly addressing poetry as something that can't be a source of comfort, that the language won't capture it, but the doing, and all those things that you do in caring for somebody who's dying that resist poetic language, yet become the poetry, right? And
The acts become, yes, yes. And I didn't think of it that way, but yes, yeah, um, yes. And part of what, I was kind of turning over in the weeks after my folks both lived to be quite old, 98 and 99. And in the weeks after they passed, a couple years, year and a half apart, 2 years apart, I found myself, I would read, especially after my mom's death, I would read poems and the words that there were words that just kept showing up in poem after poem, and there are a lot of the ones that I referenced, and I found myself annoyed by these words that seem to be such almost like the vocabulary of poetry and what poetry wants to express. And so I was trying to figure out, why is that, why is that bothering me? Why is burgeoning and deliverance and soothe and navigate and pray? Why are those things, why is talk of moon and stars? Why is that so annoying? So that was part of the what compelled me to try to explore that and see what it was about language that was just not going to do it and was in fact counterproductive. So
That's so interesting when I think about where our conversation began and how poetry is a way of being at home with yourself and expressing your true self. And I mean, the loss of a parent is so traumatic. It just upends things. So this resource that you're kind of arguing with a little bit there, like, don't even bother me with this stuff, you
yeah,
nuisance.
yeah, yeah.
It's really
You don't have an
profound.
answer. You want to, and that's why don't poetry. You don't have an answer for this.
And yet your final lines open the door to poetry again and the ineffable of your experience. It's really a beautiful poem.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can we have another one?
Sure. The one that you mentioned before, the permission, um, that one I was asked at a reading in a Q&A at the end of a reading. A person in the audience asked me, who or what gave you permission to write, to become a writer, to write? And these things sort of, marched through my mind, and I knew, that I found myself going right to, kind of the things that I knew would be typical things for, I thought about, well, I had some teachers, and, I always liked being outdoors. I liked that, blah, blah, blah. And then I just kept still for a moment and thought about the question. And this memory, which I had revisited over the years, but I'd never assigned a um, an outcome, or never thought about the meaning of the event. It just surfaced, and so this is what came to my mind, and as an answer to what gave me, or who gave me permission. The permission for my father: wood flecked pants, damp t-shirt. My father invited me outside, past my mother's clothesline and sheltered by trees, a perfect stump, cushioned by greens. Look, he said, this is for you, a little toadstool of your own. When you want to, you can sit on it and think. Scent of birch sap, slight breeze, crisp shadows, light shimmering through trees. But most of all, revelation. What I was prone to was real, belonged to me.
I just love that poem. I really do. Can I just ask, is it autobiographical?
It is. That's what.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's quite small, and that was my dad called me outside, and I went with him, and um, that's that's what happened. And I remember that feeling. When he said that, I remember just this awareness of thinking, um, being, what is it we all say now, being a thing, of thinking, of there being a word for what I tended to do. And so, and then it just, stayed with me over the years. I remember, looking at seeing the toadstool, sitting on it sometimes, but I never thought about what it was that he gave me with that experience. And it really was, it really was permission to just be as I was.
Yeah, and I think what comes across for me too is you're when I read it, I wondered about the age of the subject of the poem, the speaker, because I could see a middle-aged dad or an older dad talking to his middle-aged
Yep.
daughter, So I just kind of wondered, and as I was wondering, I thought, well, it doesn't matter, but so I was bringing myself to the poem, I suppose, but also that
That's what we do.
yeah,
That's what we
that
do.
Your dad is so was so perceptive to see that was what was needed, and
Yeah,
that it was a space that was sort of also your mother's space in a way, that it was beyond her clothesline and a place that he was aware of. And I just, the image I had in my head was my own dad, with his fleck pants and sweaty t-shirt, but also all those tucked away places in old fashioned backyards, the behind the garage spots, or the far corner of the lot where the yard debris goes, those tucked
yeah,
away sort of secret places where you look for fairies when you're a little girl,
right,
and
right.
you had found that special place for you. And so it was just so evocative and so real. And what I had said when I read the poem, there was also the physical reading, not just the hearing, the way you use the spaces to create that environment and those pauses, and just so beautifully done. So
Thank you, Sandy.
thank you for sharing that one.
Mm,
Catherine, would you indulge us with just one more? That would be really
sure,
lovely. Thanks.
sure. This is a lighter one. Um, and I picked this one just because when I was thinking about, why I write and what compels me and so on. And, I found there were a number of things. And one was what I mentioned earlier, that sometimes it's that there's been some kind of a shift. And so this poem comes from exploring that type of shift in gift giving for babies. The name of it is Baby Gift. On my baptismal day, my godparents gave me a sterling silver cup on which my monogram and date of birth are still decipherable. Its dimpled bottom seems to suggest its smithy eased body to base, the way a seamstress joins a full skirt to a bodice. Instead, it documents how, clutching the cup in my fat fist, I banged it on my wooden high chair tray. Now, young parents want to receive soothing sound machines for sleep or feeding bowls with suction cups for bottoms. After they and their children are gone, what useful object made to last will someone hold while thinking, she once held what I am holding now?
Okay, on the shelf behind me is a pewter cup with my daughter's initials and her date of birth and some serious dents.
Yes.
you know?
Yep. Mine's
You
in the
don't
hutch.
use this cup. You don't use this cup to make circles because
Yep.
you
Right.
can't.
Right.
It
Right.
is amazing, and also the soothingness of what we need now versus the crash bang and boom of growing up.
Right. Right. Yep. And and I think about just, I mean, there was a time where I think most of us who are in this, in the baby boomer age group, first of all, we were never going to say because I said so, but we also were never going to say, young people today. And when our grandchild was due, and we were planning, gatherings, and people were going to bring gifts, and I was doing the same for my friends whose children were having babies, and it got me thinking a lot because there were lots of lists, that the parents, the young parents to be all had lists of things that they wanted, and most of the lists had very, very practical things. And when I and many people in my age group were born, there weren't lists. People just decided what they'd like to give, and they gave. And I didn't come from a family of great means, but the pewter or sterling cup was every baby needs that. It's going to last them for years and years. It won't break and so on. And so it was such a difference to see the things on the list. And I got thinking about it, because I still kind of rebel against that idea that, young people today, because I think the more important question is, why are there these differences? And so I really ended up thinking a great deal about that, about the what's gained by just strictly, completely um, practical things that can then be set aside when you're done with them, and then on to the next thing, and what was gained from something that would last and could be passed on or held by someone someday. Um, and I didn't conclude that one was better than the other, but I was left with a question about what might be lost. You know, I can't judge whether that what might be lost is valuable or not. That's up to a reader, I think, to decide. But it did make me wonder.
Yeah, and I think the poem and just invites the reader to think about that question, I mean, also on the shelf behind me is my great grandmother's baby cup.
Oh wow.
And it's china and it has pink roses. So she was clearly a very good baby. You know?
Or she didn't have a high chair beneath the cup at the time.
And my grandmother prized it. And
Yes.
it was one of those things, my mother grew up in the house that her grandparents built.
Oh
And it
wow.
was, by the time it was time to sell the house, it was full of generations of stuff.
Sure.
And it got to the point where my mother would bring things home and say, well, everything's going in the dishwasher. If it doesn't melt, it's an heirloom.
I'm going to remember that.
Because there was
Oh,
that other side of it, but it's also very interesting, the generational shifts, growing up where people who endured the depression or their parents did
oh boy.
have a different mindset about
Yes.
permanence and practicality and passing things on,
Yep.
you
And
know.
what you might need if everything changes in a blink. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I think, it's also, I think your poem is also a marker of that time, marks that shift in thinking and perceptions of what's valuable, maybe, and nobody has to come down one way or another, but there we are thinking
Yeah.
about these things,
Right.
and
Right. And these things that I think a lot of us never thought we'd be thinking about.
yeah, yeah, it's fascinating. So, could I just ask you, as somebody who's been writing for some time and who published a book in 2022, what is the process? What is the process of collecting your poems and sharing your poems? What have you learned about yourself in that process?
I think that it's kind of hard for me to answer just specifically that without thinking about because so many of the poems in the book had been in journals. That was part of what that was part of the learning too about myself. So I think one thing I learned was that a lot of the poems were born of almost like data that I'd been collecting for years. These things that I just kind of just stayed with me. I didn't know why. And so that was one thing that I learned, that there were really reasons and I think that's true for people in general. It's not something about me that, only my experiences that I remember. No, there's reasons we remember certain things, a variety of reasons. Um, and then putting together the manuscript, whew, it was probably one of the most challenging things. Um, Probably one of the most challenging intellectual or brain endeavors that trying to get my arms around, get my head wrapped around um, what the pieces had in common, which pieces belonged together, which pieces didn't belong with this book, um, which pieces didn't belong anywhere, except maybe the shredder. And thematically, and which imagery seemed to come up again. All of that played a role. I had a really wonderful mentor, and she's my friend now, and she uh, is a writer, she's a very accomplished poet, and she helped to guide me through, by having me group things and see what I kept revisiting in my work and so on. So I guess, does that answer the question?
It does. It's it's interesting how mentors become friends and how relationships build through the interaction with our creative work.
Yes.
And it takes you to a really beautiful place in a relationship
Yeah.
where it's beyond the individual in some way.
It's the work. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's about the poems. And then later, it's also about how and what a gift this is, how much you just trust that person implicitly, because you can, because you can trust that person. You can reveal, you can share, you can be, and especially I think, and I guess that's one of the important things that I learned too, that once I've gotten the poem to the place that I think it should be, and it's not really mine anymore, then it's just the work. It could be anybody's, and that's how I need to be looking at it. So that was another thing that I learned.
that's really interesting. It's funny. I created a document for a poetry workshop I did that involved Newtown poets. And I just created a one pager with their poems. And I created it in Canva and different layers of this thing. It was just one of these things. And I looked at the poem and when I was in my Canva account, and I thought, wait, I didn't write that. But I felt on some level I could have.
Okay.
And it was a really very cool experience. And
Right.
then I deleted it since that was a couple years ago, that workshop, and I didn't want to make the mistake of claiming the poems at some point.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't want to commit theft. But
Yeah.
it was just that kind of thing, that poem just spoke to me so clearly, and then it was so relatable to me that I could do that. And it's just, but back to those mentors, I think they have a really interesting challenge, because they know us.
Hmm.
They've lived with our work, and yet they have to read it as if they were an outsider.
Yes.
And that is a feat. That is an intellectual and an emotional feat to be
Yeah.
able to do that.
And I think that um, one of the things that I feel so grateful to my mentor for is that in the end, excuse me, the friendship is the friendship. But when it comes to the poems and the work with the poems, it's about poetry. I'm just the vehicle, the use the V word, the vessel, and it's about the poems. And so to have that kind of mentor where the relationship allows for it is definitely about the work and honoring poetry and getting out of the way, um, getting the self out of the way when discussing it and looking at it and revising it. So I feel really just grateful and lucky to have her. She's
Yeah,
wonderful.
I just so appreciate that you're saying all that, because I think, that's the discipline of the art and the refining of the craft and the message. And it's not easy, because without the right mentor or the right person to give you feedback, you can be edited out of the work to the point where it's feels sterile or
Yes.
pointless. And it's kind of oxymoronic that when it's so completely an expression of your experience, then it's not yours anymore.
Yes.
How
Yes.
does that work? It's really fascinating, you
Right.
know?
Right. I think in a way, I maybe it works because the thing was already there, let's say, as that felt sense. And the job was to find the language that matched that that felt understanding. And then once the language is exactly right to match that exact thing, then it is that piece, but brought to the outside world, and the rest of what we're born with doesn't matter. The person doesn't. I mean, I'm going to be dead, and if these things are still around, if it means something to somebody, well, then you know, then it won't be because of me. It's what's left of.
That's right. I believe that Zeus's daughters find us. The muses find their vessels for sure. You know, call us what
I've
you
never
will.
thought of it that way. I love
Yeah, there's no hiding. You know.
love that. Zeus's daughters find us. I love that.
Oh, this has been a great conversation, Catherine. Do you have any recommendations for people who might be thinking about poetry or writing it and stuffing it in a drawer, you know, or just feel like I don't have the time, I got my day job. What would you recommend for them if they want to
Well,
find their
I
voice?
think that I think one thing that it's not a bad idea to have, um, have a pad of paper around where you can just. I leave paper on my nightstand because sometimes, that I'm sure there's a name for probably a poetic name for that place between sleep and full wakefulness, where some of these insights and understandings, when you wake up just on that edge of sleep, and you had the answer to who knows what, I don't know what, but some kind of answer. And I think that the ideas that come then, for some of us, are really worth exploring. So having a pad on the nightstand, I think, is a good idea. But I think mostly just trusting what your gut is telling you about pursuing an idea, and that is worth your time. And if you feel like yourself when you're doing it, then why wouldn't you want to have that place to really just both withdraw from the world and explore it?
Well, thank you. And and I think the other magic of poetry is it's ourselves and a pad of paper and a pen.
Yeah.
And it takes us someplace, and that is the pure magic of it. And I'm really grateful to you, Catherine, today for your conversation and your insights and your poetry.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm grateful to you, and thank you for having me. And I enjoyed the conversation very much.
This has been People and Their Poems, presented by Oronog Mountain Publishing. Thanks for joining us. Be sure to check the show notes for more information about this episode. Visit oronogmountainpublishing.com for more information about our services and writing opportunities. And visit peopleandtheirpoems.net to learn more about the podcast.